March 4, 1995. 2 a.m. The fluorescent lights of the Kim Anh restaurant hummed softly in the stillness of New Orleans East. Inside, the family was closing up for the night, counting the day's earnings, wiping down tables, preparing to lock the doors and head home. It was routine. Familiar. See? Then the silence shattered. Gunshots exploded through the restaurant. 3 people would be dead within minutes. But this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't some random act of violence in a city that had seen too much blood. This was something far worse. Because the person holding the gun wasn't just a killer. She was wearing a police uniform. And she was supposed to be protecting them. Sir Antoinette Frank had worked security at this restaurant before. The Vietnamese family who owned it knew her face, trusted her badge, welcomed her presence. She had built that trust deliberately, meal by meal, shift by shift. And on this cold March night, she weaponized it. 3 people lay dead. Officer Ronald Williams II, her fellow NOPD officer working security. Ha Vu, 24 years old. Quang Vu, just 17. A 4th person survived only by hiding in the walk-in cooler, listening in terror as the violence unfolded outside. But here's where the betrayal becomes almost incomprehensible. After the murders, Frank left the scene. Then she returned, still in uniform, posing as a responding officer. Before we dive into one of Louisiana's most shocking cases of police corruption, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. And if you're here for true crime that exposes the darkest betrayals of trust, hit that subscribe button because this case will challenge everything you think you know about the badge. This is the story of Antoinette Frank, the only woman on Louisiana's death row, 30 years after a night that shook New Orleans to its core. Let's begin. To understand how a police officer becomes a killer, we need to go back to the beginning. The early 1990s. New Orleans was a city wrestling with its own demons, poverty, violence, and a police department whose reputation was in tatters. Corruption scandals made headlines regularly. Officers were being arrested for crimes ranging from drug trafficking to murder. Public trust in the NOPD was at an all-time low. Into this troubled department walked Antoinette Frank, a young black woman who represented, on the surface at least, a glimmer of hope. A new generation. Someone who could help restore faith in the badge. She took her oath. She wore the uniform. She patrolled the streets of New Orleans with the authority of the law behind her. But behind that badge, a darker reality was quietly emerging, one that nobody saw coming until it was too late. At some point during her time with the NOPD, Antoinette Frank began a relationship with an 18-year-old named Rogers Lacaze. He wasn't a fellow officer. He wasn't a law-abiding citizen. He had a criminal history, the kind of background that should have raised immediate red flags for someone wearing a badge. Yet somehow this relationship developed and deepened. How does a police officer end up romantically involved with someone on the wrong side of the law? What warning signs did her supervisors miss or ignore? These questions would haunt investigators later, but at the time, nobody intervened. Nobody pulled Frank aside and questioned her judgment. The relationship continued, and Lacaze's influence over her, or perhaps her influence over him, would prove catastrophic. But there was another relationship Frank was cultivating, one that seemed innocent on the surface. The Kim Anh restaurant on Bullard Avenue in New Orleans East became a regular stop for Officer Frank. She worked paid off-duty security details there, a common practice where officers earn extra income protecting businesses during vulnerable hours. For the Vu family, having a uniformed police officer on site was reassuring. They got to know Frank. She became familiar with their routines, their children, the rhythm of their business. Ha Vu and Quang Vu, the owner's adult children who helped run the restaurant, saw her as a protector. Frank learned when they closed, when they counted money, where they kept cash, the layout of the building, every vulnerability. She was mapping the restaurant not as a guardian but as a predator. The Kim Anh wasn't just a place she protected, it was becoming her hunting ground. And the family's trust in her badge would become the very weapon she'd use to destroy them. Think about this. A police officer, someone sworn to protect, building trust with a family only to betray them in the most brutal way. What does that say about the power of a badge? The uniform opens doors. It creates vulnerability. When you see a cop, your guard drops. That's exactly what the Vu family did. They welcomed Frank into their lives, never imagining that the woman in blue would become their nightmare. By early 1995, all the pieces were in place. March 4, 1995. 2 a.m. The Kim Anh restaurant should have been winding down for the night. The last customers had left hours ago. Now it was just family, closing up, counting the day's earnings, preparing to lock the doors and go home. For people were inside that night. Officer Ronald Williams II, a fellow NOPD officer working his off-duty security shift. He was there to protect the restaurant, to ensure the family could close safely in a city where late-night businesses were vulnerable. Ha Vu, 24 years old, the restaurant owner's daughter. She had her whole life ahead of her. Quang Vu, just 17, the owner's son. Still a teenager with dreams not yet realized. And Chow Vu, another family member, helping count the money and prepare for closing. It was routine. Familiar. They'd done this hundreds of times before. Then Antoinette Frank and Rogers Lacaze walked through the door. Frank knew exactly what she was doing. She knew the layout of the restaurant like the back of her hand. She knew the closing routine. She knew when the money would be counted and where it would be. She had spent months learning every detail, building trust, positioning herself. Now she was weaponizing that knowledge. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The late-night silence of New Orleans East surrounded them. And then that silence was shattered by gunshots. Officer Ronald Williams II was killed. A fellow cop murdered by one of his own. The man who thought he was working alongside a trusted colleague died at her hands. Ha Vu, 24 years old, was killed. Quang Vu, just 17, was killed. 3 lives ended in moments. 3 families destroyed. And one person, Chow Vu, made a desperate decision that would save her life. Chow Vu ran. In the chaos and terror, she found the walk-in cooler and hid inside, pulling the heavy door closed behind her. In the cold darkness, she listened to the violence unfolding outside. Gunshots, voices, movement, the sounds of her family members being murdered. She stayed silent. She stayed hidden. She stayed alive. Pause for a second. If this story is gripping you but you haven't hit the like button yet, here's why you should. Every like tells YouTube that stories about police accountability and justice matter. It takes 1 second. Can you do that to ensure cases like this don't get buried? When the sounds finally stopped, Chow remained in the cooler. She didn't know if the killers were still there. She didn't know if it was safe to emerge. She waited in the freezing cold, traumatized, terrified, and alone. Meanwhile, Antoinette Frank and Rogers Lacaze left the scene. They had what they came for. 3 people were dead. The robbery was complete. But Frank wasn't finished. Shortly after leaving, she returned to the Kim Anh restaurant, still wearing her police uniform. She radioed in as a responding officer, arriving at the scene of her own crime. The audacity was breathtaking. She was playing the hero at her own massacre. This wasn't panic. This wasn't a criminal trying to cover her tracks in desperation. This was calculated. An abuse of authority in its most chilling form. When Chow Vu finally emerged from the walk-in cooler, she saw Frank standing there in uniform. And in that moment, the horror became complete. The woman posing as a rescuer was one of the killers. Chow didn't hesitate. That's one of them. She was here. The familiar officer. The trusted presence. Now revealed as a murderer. Antoinette Frank was arrested that same night. The evidence was overwhelming. An eyewitness who survived. Physical evidence at the scene. And Frank's own presence, returning to play the role of responding officer. During interrogations, she eventually confessed to her involvement in the murders. The details matched what investigators already knew. There was no way out, no plausible denial. The betrayal was complete. A sworn officer had used her badge to facilitate murder. New Orleans was horrified. October 1995. 7 months after the murders at Kim Anh restaurant, Antoinette Frank's trial began. The courtroom was packed. Media coverage was relentless. New Orleans wanted answers, and more than that, they wanted justice for 3 people murdered by someone who'd sworn to protect them. The prosecution's case was devastating in its simplicity and strength. They didn't need complicated forensics or circumstantial theories. They had everything they needed to put Frank away for life, or end it. First they had Chow Vu, the survivor who'd hidden in the walk-in cooler while her family members were murdered. Her testimony was powerful, detailed, and unshakable. She identified Frank without hesitation. She described what happened with clarity that left no room for doubt. Then came Frank's own confession. Her words, recorded during interrogation, admitting her involvement in the crime. Physical evidence from the scene corroborated everything. Ballistics, blood spatter, the timeline of events. Every piece fit together perfectly, building an ironclad case that the defense couldn't dismantle. But what intensified the public outrage beyond the murders themselves was the victim list. Officer Ronald Williams II wasn't just another victim. He was a fellow cop. Frank had murdered one of her own. A brother in blue, working security to protect a family, killed by someone wearing the same uniform. The betrayal of the badge narrative dominated every news cycle. Headlines screamed about police corruption, about trust violated, about a protector who became a predator. This wasn't just a murder trial. It was a referendum on what the badge was supposed to mean. The jury deliberated, and in less than 30 minutes, they returned with their verdict. Guilty. 3 counts of first-degree murder. The speed of the decision spoke volumes. There was no reasonable doubt, no ambiguity, no question about what Antoinette Frank had done. The evidence was overwhelming, the eyewitness testimony credible, and Frank's own confession sealed her fate. But the trial wasn't over. Now came the sentencing phase, the moment when the jury would decide whether Frank would spend the rest of her life in prison or face execution. They deliberated again, and in less than 1 hour they delivered their sentence: death. For prosecutors, this was justice served swiftly and decisively. 3 lives taken, and the person responsible would pay the ultimate price. For future defense teams, however, this case would become something very different. A rushed trial that needed serious re-examination. Here's what that jury never heard. Antoinette Frank had survived severe childhood abuse at the hands of her father. Court records and advocacy organizations would later reveal trauma that shaped her psychology, made her vulnerable to manipulation, and influenced her capacity for decision-making. This mitigation evidence, the kind of background information that can mean the difference between life and death in capital cases, wasn't presented during her trial. Would it have mattered? Would it have changed the outcome? We'll never know. Frank's conviction was affirmed through state appeals. She was sent to Louisiana's death row, becoming the only woman in the state facing execution. But the question that dominated public consciousness wasn't about trauma or mitigation. It was about the badge, the uniform, the authority she'd weaponized. Public outrage wasn't just about 3 murders. It was about trust violated at the most fundamental level. A protector had become a predator, and that made her crime unforgivable in the eyes of many. Antoinette Frank wasn't the only person sentenced to death for the Kim Anh murders. Her accomplice, Rogers Lacaze, was also convicted and sent to death row alongside her. 4 years, they both waited in separate facilities. Frank at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, Lacaze in Angola's death row. Both facing execution for the same crime. Both convicted of the same 3 murders. Then, in December 2019, something changed. Rogers Lacaze was resentenced. His death sentence was overturned, and in its place, he received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He would never walk free, but he would also never face execution. He walked off death row. Antoinette Frank remained. This disparity, this stark difference in their ultimate punishments, has become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case, fueling debates that continue to this day. The question that won't go away is simple but profound. If Rogers Lacaze, who some argue was the mastermind behind the robbery, received life in prison, why does Antoinette Frank still face execution? Prosecutors and supporters of Frank's death sentence have a clear answer. The badge changes everything. Frank wasn't just a participant in murder. She was a police officer who weaponized her authority to facilitate the crime. She used her position of trust to gain access to the restaurant. She knew the layout, the routine, the vulnerabilities because she'd been paid to protect the very people she murdered. The uniform elevated her culpability. The badge made her betrayal unique. A civilian committing murder is heinous. A police officer committing murder while using their authority? That's a different level of violation, they argue. A different level of trust destroyed. But critics see it differently. Both Frank and Lacaze participated in the same murders. Both pulled triggers. Both are responsible for 3 deaths: Officer Williams, Ha Vu, and Quang Vu. If both are equally guilty of taking those lives, why should their punishments be so drastically different? Some legal experts point to potential gender bias in sentencing. Others raise concerns about the death penalty's arbitrary application. Why does one accomplice live while another faces execution? The inconsistency, they argue, reveals fundamental problems with capital punishment itself. Advocates for Frank have seized on this disparity as grounds for commutation. If the state deemed Lacaze's crimes worthy of life imprisonment rather than death, shouldn't Frank receive the same consideration? Prosecutors counter that the distinction remains valid. The badge matters. The betrayal of public trust matters. Frank's crime was categorically different because of her position of authority. This disparity is one of the most controversial aspects of the case. Do you think Frank's badge made her crime worse than Lacaze's involvement? Or should they both face the same punishment? Let me know in the comments. The debate reveals deeper questions about how we measure culpability, whether professional positions should elevate criminal responsibility, and whether the death penalty can ever be applied consistently and fairly. For now, Lacaze lives. Frank waits on death row. The disparity remains unexplained to the satisfaction of many observers. 1995 to 2025. 30 years. That's how long Antoinette Frank has been sitting on Louisiana's death row at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women. 3 decades waiting for an execution that has never come. The only woman in Louisiana facing the death penalty, isolated in a system designed for finality that moves at a glacial pace. During those 30 years, Frank has filed appeals. They've been denied. She's filed more appeals. The legal machinery grinds slowly, procedurally, endlessly. Motions, hearings, petitions, reviews, each one a step in a process that seems designed to stretch justice to its breaking point. Is this justice? Or is this prolonged suffering? The answer depends on who you ask. For the victims' families, every appeal delays closure. For Frank's advocates, every appeal is another chance to correct what they see as a fundamentally flawed conviction and sentence. October 2023 marked a critical moment in Frank's case. The Louisiana Board of Pardons agreed to consider clemency petitions on her behalf, a rare opportunity that could potentially commute her death sentence to life imprisonment. Frank's advocates mobilized. 50 anti-gender violence organizations signed petitions urging the board to show mercy. Legal teams prepared presentations. New evidence was compiled and organized for review. The central argument? That Antoinette Frank's jury never heard crucial mitigation evidence that should have played a significant role in her sentencing. Court records and psychiatric evaluations revealed something the 1995 jury never knew. Frank had survived severe childhood abuse at the hands of her father. The violence she experienced wasn't just physical, it was psychological, sustained, and deeply traumatic. Her defense teams argued that this abuse shaped her vulnerability to manipulation, impaired her decision-making capacity, and created psychological damage that contributed to her actions. The hearing was emotional and deeply divided. Victim family members took the floor, their grief still raw nearly 3 decades later. The Vu family spoke about the children they'd lost, Ha and Quang, whose futures were stolen. Officer Ronald Williams' family spoke about justice delayed but still necessary, about their loved one who died protecting others, murdered by one of his own. Frank's supporters presented their evidence. The childhood trauma, the abuse, the mitigation factors that could have changed the jury's decision in 1995. Both sides made compelling arguments. If you've made it this far, you're clearly invested in understanding the complexities of justice and the death penalty. But here's the thing. Most of you watching haven't subscribed yet. This channel survives on viewers like you who want deep, well-researched content that doesn't shy away from difficult questions. If you want more investigations like this, click that subscribe button. You won't regret it. The Louisiana Board of Pardons deliberated and reached their decision. Clemency denied. Antoinette Frank's death sentence would remain intact. The arguments about childhood trauma, about mitigation evidence, about the disparity with Lacaze's sentence, none of it was enough to change the board's mind. Frank would stay on death row. However, as of early 2025, no execution date has been set. Frank continues waiting in her cell, 3 decades into a sentence that may or may not ever be carried out. During these years, she's watched other inmates executed. She's witnessed Louisiana's execution methods evolve, including the state's recent adoption of nitrogen hypoxia in 2025 as an alternative to lethal injection. Her future remains uncertain, trapped in a legal limbo between life and death, where time moves slowly but the threat of execution never disappears. Disclaimer: Antoinette Frank has not been executed and remains on Louisiana's death row as of 2025. What follows is a procedural exploration of what Louisiana's execution protocol dictates, not a description of events that have occurred. If an execution date were ever scheduled for Antoinette Frank, the process would begin days before the actual execution. Prison officials would conduct a property inventory. The condemned person would be allowed to keep only essentials: a radio, legal materials, a Bible, and limited personal effects. Everything else would be cataloged and removed. Constant security watch logs would be maintained, documenting every movement, every visitor, every moment leading up to the scheduled execution. Final visits would be scheduled with family members and spiritual advisors, allowing for last goodbyes under heavily monitored conditions. Last meal would be served several hours before the scheduled execution time. Louisiana allows condemned prisoners to make reasonable requests, within budget limits and availability. Some choose comfort foods from their childhood. Others request elaborate meals. Some decline the meal entirely, unable to eat in their final hours. Following the meal, preparation for execution would begin. This includes shaving areas where heart monitor leads will be placed, a clinical, dehumanizing process that reduces a person to a body being prepared for termination. The condemned person would change into specific clothing designated by the protocol, removing all personal items. Medical personnel would be on standby, though their role in executions raises ethical questions within the medical community about participating in taking life rather than saving it. In the final hours, witnesses would be notified and escorted to the execution facility. This typically includes victim family members who have chosen to attend, media representatives, prison officials, and sometimes the condemned person's own family or spiritual advisors. The condemned person would be given an opportunity to make a final statement. Some choose to speak directly to witnesses, offering apologies or maintaining innocence. Some address victim families specifically. Others remain completely silent, choosing not to give their final words to an audience. Louisiana has historically used lethal injection as its execution method. However, in 2025, the state conducted its first nitrogen hypoxia execution, signaling a potential shift in how future executions might be carried out. This method involves replacing breathable air with pure nitrogen, causing death by oxygen deprivation. But for Antoinette Frank, all of these procedures remain hypothetical. No execution date has been scheduled. Louisiana has not indicated when, or if, they will proceed with her case. Her appeals continue. Her clemency efforts persist. Her case remains trapped in legal limbo, somewhere between life and death. 3 decades and counting. Frank sits in her cell, the only woman on Louisiana's death row, waiting for a finality that may never come, or may arrive without warning when the state decides her time has run out. Before we close, we must remember the victims who can never be forgotten. Officer Ronald Williams II. He was a son, a brother, a colleague who showed up to work that night to protect a family. He trusted a fellow officer, and that trust cost him his life. Havu, 24 years old. A beloved daughter with dreams, ambitions, and a future that was stolen in moments. Her family lost not just a child, but all the milestones she would never reach. Quang Vu, just 17. A teenager who never got to graduate, never got to fall in love, never got to discover who he would become. Their families carry this grief forward every single day. No punishment, no matter how severe, can restore what was taken from them. No execution can bring their loved ones back. No amount of justice can fill the void left behind. The victims' families have been consistent in their advocacy. They want justice through execution. For them, Frank's death sentence represents accountability for the murders she committed. Every appeal, every clemency hearing, every legal delay prolongs their wait for closure and their ability to move forward. Their voices matter deeply in this debate. But the questions surrounding Frank's case are complex and uncomfortable. Was she a cold-blooded killer who deserves the ultimate punishment? Or was she a damaged person, shaped by severe childhood trauma and manipulated into participating in a crime that ended in murder? Does her history of abuse mitigate her responsibility? Should the badge make her more culpable than her accomplice, Rogers Lacaze? Does the disparity between their sentences reveal systemic problems with how we apply the death penalty? These aren't easy questions and they don't have simple answers. Frank's case highlights the death penalty's arbitrary application. 30 years on death row, is this justice, or is this prolonged psychological torture? Questions of gender bias linger. The role of mitigation evidence, information about childhood trauma that her jury never heard, raises concerns about whether her trial was truly fair. At what point does punishment become something else entirely? In death penalty cases, closure can take decades, if it arrives at all. Frank's story remains unfinished, a narrative without an ending. She sits on Louisiana's death row, the only woman facing execution in the state, caught in an endless cycle of legal appeals, clemency efforts, and the slow, grinding machinery of capital punishment. Capital punishment, despite its name, is anything but swift. It's a process that can stretch across lifetimes, leaving everyone involved, victims' families, the condemned, and society, in perpetual limbo. Like most true crime stories, this one has no ending yet. Antoinette Frank sits in her cell today. The Vu family grieves today. Officer Williams' family seeks justice today. The debate about her fate continues today. This case is still living, still evolving, still unresolved. Antoinette Frank's case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, punishment, and the badges we trust. If this investigation made you think, if you believe these complex cases deserve thorough examination, show your support by liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives that don't shy away from difficult truths. What's your biggest takeaway? Should Frank be executed, or should her sentence be commuted? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, justice isn't always simple, and the truth is rarely black and white. I'll see you in the next investigation.